Imagine standing in the bone-chilling dawn of Stalingrad on the first days of May 1943. The sky, a dull silver gray, hangs low over rows of buildings that have been reduced to concrete skeletons. The wind, coming off the Volga, sweeps through the charred walls, whistling past shattered window frames, carrying with it a strange sound, almost like the final breath of a city that has endured a 200-day struggle for life. The first light of morning doesn't fall on any street still left intact. Instead, it spills across ruins crushed by relentless shelling, over proud arches now bent and broken, as if twisted by an invisible giant hand. This is more than the aftermath of a battle. This is the place where a military superpower that once dominated nearly all of Europe was shattered to its core. Through the heavy mist, you see a column of Nazi soldiers staggering over the rubble. Gone is the fierce confidence of the force that launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. Gone is the aura of an army once believed to be unstoppable. All that remains are hollow eyes, gaunt faces worn thin by hunger and cold, and footsteps weighed down by a defeat from which there is no return. Among them, you notice a young German officer. He holds his steel helmet in one hand, his fingers trembling. No one can tell, whether from the cold or from fear. But when you look into his eyes, you understand the unthinkable truth that all of Europe once doubted. The German Sixth Army has been utterly broken. The Battle of Stalingrad is over. And as you turn your gaze toward the fog-blurred horizon, a question rises, not from any living voice, but as if awakening from the very dust and debris beneath your feet. How did a nation that stood on the brink of annihilation in the summer of 1941 transform itself into the most fearsome war machine of the 20th century? A machine powerful enough to crush the Nazi Empire right here in Stalingrad. That question opens the door to a truth far deeper than any military victory. Because behind these ruins lies the true nature of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a state forged from a strange combination of forced industrialization, an almost absolute will to survive, totalitarian propaganda, and a political system so brutal it nearly tore itself apart. And if you listen closely, you can hear another sound rising from deep beneath the ground, the metallic clatter of steel striking steel. Not the sound of battle, but the echo of millions of bullets and shell casings once produced in factories far beyond the Ural Mountains. Those echoes are the legacy of the largest industrial relocation in human history, launched immediately after Nazi Germany's surprise attack on June 22, 1941. A relocation so massive, so audacious, and so desperate that only two outcomes were possible: survival or complete erasure from the map. But to understand how the Soviet Union managed to stand firm and rise again from the very edge of collapse, one must accept a difficult truth. Its history was never linear. Behind the triumph at Stalingrad lay bloody purges, catastrophic strategic blunders, close brushes with total destruction, and decisions still debated to this day. It was this interplay of light and darkness that forged a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Stalingrad was merely the final chapter. The real story begins in the dying nights of the Russian Empire, in the flames of the 1917 revolution, and in the choices, unimaginably costly ones, that no other nation of the 20th century would ever be forced to make. And so, to truly understand how the Soviet Union halted Nazi Germany and shaped the century that followed, we must return to the point where the storm first began to form.
To understand how the Soviet Union rose to become the war machine capable of breaking the Nazi army at Stalingrad in 1943, we must return to the place where the storm first began. not on the battlefield, but in the cold, fading nights of an aging empire slipping steadily into darkness. The Russian Empire. Picture yourself standing inside the Winter Palace in Petrograd during the winter of 1916. The gilded ceilings that once symbolized Romanov glory now drown in thick shadows. Candlelight flickers against marble walls, yet it cannot chase away the sense of unease suffocating the entire court. Outside the massive gates, long lines of civilians shiver in the cold, waiting for a single loaf of bread, something a 20 million square kilometer empire could no longer provide. Inside, Tsar Nicholas II sits at his desk, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Every report he reads speaks only of failure, shortages, unrest, and warnings that the 300-year-old empire is cracking from within. Though he tries to deny it, even his closest advisors understand the truth. The House of Romanov no longer has a foundation to stand on. This collapse didn't happen overnight. By the late 19th century, as Europe surged forward with breakneck industrialization, Russia remained shackled to an outdated agrarian system. The 1861 reforms freed millions of serfs, but by the early 20th century, most of the population still lived in poverty, illiteracy, and dependence on landowners. A vast empire, yet a giant standing on feet of clay. And then war erupted. On July 30th, 1914, the Russian Empire entered World War I. Generals promised a swift victory, but what followed was devastation on a scale never seen before. Russian forces suffered repeated defeats against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The home front collapsed, railways jammed, food supplies dwindled, prices soared, and public anger surged. In the midst of this chaos, one name rose as a collective nightmare: Grigory Rasputin. Despised by the nobility, yet trusted completely by Empress Alexandra, his presence became, in the eyes of the people, a symbol of the monarchy's decay. Whether his actual influence was exaggerated or not, Rasputin embodied one undeniable truth: this empire could no longer save itself. Then came the fatal decision. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II took personal command of the army. It was a catastrophic mistake. As defeat followed defeat, the people no longer blamed the generals. They blamed the Tsar himself. By early 1917, the situation was beyond rescue. In February 1917, tens of thousands of workers in Petrograd went on strike as bread prices soared. Protests spread rapidly, and soldiers sent to suppress them instead turned their rifles to support the crowds. An empire once considered the great eastern bulwark of Europe collapsed within weeks. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty ended after more than 300 years. Yet the fall of the monarchy did not bring stability. Instead, it opened a dangerous power vacuum. The provisional government struggled to continue the war, to honor its commitments to the Allies, while the Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, grew increasingly powerful, demanding immediate peace and an end to the old order. Debate ignited in the heart of Petrograd. Would Russia become a parliamentary democracy like Britain or France, or would it plunge into a proletarian revolution, a path no nation had ever taken before? Some historians argue that Russia could have become a constitutional democracy had the events of October 1917 not occurred. Others believe the empire had rotted too deeply and revolution was inevitable. Wherever the truth lies, one thing remained unchanged. The years 1914 to 1917 shattered the entire political and social structure of the Russian Empire. And from those ashes, a new force began to emerge, powerful, ambitious, and willing to use any means necessary to achieve its goals. But before the Soviet Union could rise as the most fearsome military empire of the 20th century, Russia first had to endure a trial even more terrifying than the Great War: a civil war. One where the enemy was not a foreign invader, but Russians facing each other in the dark.
Rich descriptions of scenery, sound, emotion. When the last shots of the Russian Civil War faded in the early 1920s, the country, now the USSR, resembled a giant body gasping for breath after surgery without anesthesia. Industry lay paralyzed. The countryside was devastated. Food was desperately scarce. Transportation was in chaos. A new empire had been born in blood, but it stood on a foundation that was nearly destroyed. And it was at this moment of apparent weakness that a man stepped quietly onto the stage of history. A man without the aura of a revolutionary hero, without Lenin's charisma, without Trotsky's oratory and brilliance, but possessing something no one else had: patience, cold calculation, and unshakable ambition. His name was Joseph Stalin. January 21, 1924. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin passes away after years of failing health. The entire Soviet Union falls into mourning, but behind the veil of grief, a quiet yet brutal struggle for power begins. Public attention turns to Leon Trotsky, the architect of the October Revolution, the commander of the Red Army, and the man many believe to be Lenin's natural successor. What Trotsky didn't realize was that while he spent years racing across the country on an armored train, another man had been quietly building his own empire inside the Soviet state. That man was Stalin. Since April 1922, Stalin held the position of General Secretary of the party, a role that seemed ordinary, administrative, even dull. But Stalin understood something the romantic revolutionaries never grasped. Real power lies in the ability to choose people. Who gets promoted? Who gets appointed? Who controls the provinces, the factories, the committees, the central apparatus? Every vote, every signature, every closed-door meeting gradually flowed into Stalin's hands. By the time his rivals, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, realized the truth, they discovered that they had been surrounded for years. But personal power was only half the story. The other half was Stalin's vision: an industrial base strong enough to defend the Soviet state, something Imperial Russia never possessed. And that vision took form in 1928. The first 5-year plan, a daring leap into industrialization. April 1928, the first 5-year plan begins. Stalin demands the USSR industrialize faster than any nation in history. Steel, coal, electricity, machinery, all must skyrocket in just a few years. Barren land becomes construction sites. Magnitogorsk rises from empty hills into one of Europe's largest steel centers. The scenes border on surreal. Trains packed with workers pushing through snowstorms, factories rising from frozen plains, chimneys blasting white steam day and night, millions of peasants pouring into cities, railroads running 24 hours a day, plants operating without pause. And from these relentless years, the foundation for the future fight against Nazi Germany was forged. The steelworks, the machine plants, the industrial giants of the Urals, where T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and Mosin Nagant rifles would be produced. The dark side,
collectivization, and famine. Behind this glowing picture of industrial growth lay a terrible price. Beginning in 1929, Stalin forced peasants into collective farms. Historians debate the motives, but the outcome is undeniable. The famine of 1932-1933. Millions perished, especially in Ukraine. Industrialization surged, but at a human cost almost impossible to comprehend. Yet the story grows darker still. Stalin was not only building factories, he was tightening control over the security apparatus. By the late 1920s, he had a firm grip over the OGPU. In 1934, it merged into the newly empowered NKVD, an institution with near absolute authority. State security no longer meant protecting the nation, it meant protecting Stalin, from threats real or imagined. And from this machinery of fear, a storm began to form, a storm known as the Great Purge. The Great Purge takes shape between 1936 and 1938. By the mid-1930s, on the surface, the USSR was booming, factories blazing, cities rising, production records shattered. But beneath this steel facade, a political storm gathered strength. December 1st, 1934, Leningrad. Sergei Kirov, beloved party leader, is assassinated. Historians still debate the motive. One fact is certain. Kirov's death became Stalin's catalyst for consolidating power on an unprecedented scale. Between 1936 and 1938, dramatic public trials unfold in Moscow. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, titans of the revolution, now confessing to crimes of treason and conspiracy. Most confessions extracted through coercion. Meanwhile, under NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, mass arrests sweep the nation. Hundreds of thousands detained, workers, teachers, engineers, journalists, artists, officials. Anyone could be arrested for a rumor, an accusation, or a past association. The military purge, a deadly blow. The Red Army is struck hardest. Marshal Tukhachevsky, executed. Iona Yakir, arrested. Vasily Blucher, arrested. In total, 40% of senior officers are removed. A nation can survive shortages of steel. It cannot survive the loss of its greatest commanders. The USSR marched toward war, with its military leadership shattered. Historians still debate how deeply this weakened the Soviet Union, but the consensus? It mattered, gravely. Fear now governed society, fear of arrest, fear of denunciation, fear of speaking or staying silent. And here lies the irony. While Stalin eliminated those he saw as threats, he also crippled the very war machine he was trying to build. And then Hitler struck. To the west, another force was preparing for the boldest invasion of the century. June 22nd, dawn breaks. Operation Barbarossa begins. The guns roar. The Wehrmacht advances. The Soviet Union faces not only the power of Nazi Germany, but also the consequences of its own internal destruction. The Great Purge had ended, but its legacy became painfully clear the moment war came knocking.
In the early hours of June 22, 1941, before the sun had even risen over the Bug River, the first flashes of Operation Barbarossa tore through the sky.
More than 3 million Nazi German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across the border at once. The largest military invasion in human history had begun. And in that moment, the Soviet Union stood on the brink of being wiped out within months. The bitter truth was, the USSR had been warned. Warnings from Richard Sorge in Tokyo, from British intelligence, from Soviet reports, even from German defectors, all pointing to the same message: Germany was preparing to strike. But after the trauma of the Great Purge, Stalin trusted no one. He believed the warnings were Western provocations, tricks designed to break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so, until the very last moment, the Red Army was not fully prepared. When the first explosions hit, frontline Soviet airfields lost hundreds of planes, destroyed while still parked on the ground. Border units were encircled within hours. Newly promoted commanders, many replacing those purged, lacked experience to lead large-scale operations. This wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a shockwave that cracked the Soviet military structure right at its weakest point. The speed of the German advance stunned the world. Within weeks, Army Group Center pushed hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, encircling Red Army forces at Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group South seized the fertile lands of Ukraine. In 3 months, Nazi Germany controlled territory unheard of in European history. But what changed history was not Germany's strength. It was the fact that the Soviet Union did not collapse. And the reason behind that impossible survival came from one extraordinary strategic decision: the massive industrial evacuation to the Ural Mountains. As the Western Front crumbled, Stalin ordered more than 1,700 factories to be relocated from west to east, thousands of kilometers by rail. Entire production lines, machines weighing hundreds of tons, tens of thousands of workers and their families, all loaded onto trains running day and night. It became one of the largest, boldest industrial relocations in human history. By winter 1941, factories in the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan were reborn, producing weapons, ammunition, and the now legendary T-34 tanks in growing numbers. These new industrial fortresses, safe from German artillery, became the backbone of the Soviet war machine. But steel alone didn't save the USSR. There was another force, an invisible one: willpower. October 1941. German forces closed in on Moscow. Panic swept the capital, but Stalin refused to leave. On November 7th, he appeared at the Red Square Parade, watching Soviet troops march past him and head straight to the front lines. It wasn't just symbolic. It was a message: Moscow would not be abandoned. Then came the brutal Russian winter. Fresh reserve divisions from Siberia, hardened by years of fighting in ice and snow, were thrown into the counteroffensive. By late December 1941, German forces were pushed back for the first time. Operation Barbarossa had failed to crush the Soviet Union within months. Hitler's blitzkrieg had broken. But the price the USSR paid was almost beyond comprehension. Millions of soldiers dead or wounded, millions of civilians displaced, vast territories occupied, one of the harshest blows any modern nation had ever endured. But in these darkest months, the Soviet military began to be reborn. A new generation of commanders emerged: Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossky, Ivan Konev. They didn't just replace the purged generals. They learned fast, from disaster, from chaos, from necessity, and built the foundation of Soviet total war. Operation Barbarossa could have erased the USSR from the map. Instead, from the very edge of collapse, the Soviet counterattack began. And less than a year later, in a city called Stalingrad, the world would witness the greatest turning point of the war. After Barbarossa failed to bring down the Soviet Union in the few months Adolf Hitler had confidently predicted, the rest of the world still believed the USSR was unlikely to recover. They had lost millions of soldiers, thousands of kilometers of fertile land, their biggest industrial centers, their entire logistics network in the West. But there was one thing Nazi Germany failed to see, or saw far too late. The Soviet Union was transforming into a war machine unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. By spring 1942, the factories evacuated from European Russia were operating at full capacity in the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. Over 1,700 factories had been moved just in the final months of 1941. A logistical achievement many historians call the greatest industrial relocation of the 20th century. These new centers weren't just rebuilt, they were expanded. The tank factory at Nizhny Tagil alone produced tens of thousands of T-34 tanks, the most effective tank of 1942, thanks to its sloped armor, mobility, firepower, and above all, its ability to be mass-produced. On the home front, the Soviet Union entered a state of total mobilization. Everything for the front, everything for victory. The slogan echoed everywhere. Millions worked 12 to 16 hours a day. Women, teenagers, even the elderly became part of the massive industrial effort. The conditions were brutal, but they understood if the Soviet Union fell, their entire future would fall with it. And from these factories came T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, Mosin Nagant rifles, Degtyaryov machine guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition, all rushing straight to the front. While Nazi Germany needed months to produce a single Tiger tank, the Soviet Union could produce dozens of T-34s in the same time. This wasn't a test of engineering elegance. It was a war of production, and the Soviet Union knew quantity was a weapon. But the role of the USSR in World War II was not defined only by factories. Its true legacy was shaped somewhere else, in a city called Stalingrad. From the summer of 1942 until February 2, 1943, Stalingrad became the meeting point of two unbreakable wills: Hitler's determination to capture the city that bore his enemy's name, and the Soviet resolve to hold it at all costs to protect the southern flank and the oil routes from the Caucasus. The fighting surpassed every standard of war. Stalingrad became a labyrinth of rubble, house by house, staircase by staircase, wall by wall. Zhukov's 62nd Army fought at point-blank range. German soldiers called it the meat grinder. Every meter cost lives. While German forces were dragged deeper into the urban hell, the Soviets quietly prepared a massive counterstroke. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, striking the weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian flanks. Within days, over 200,000 German troops were encircled in the infamous Stalingrad pocket. Hitler ordered them to hold. He believed they could be supplied by air, but the Luftwaffe could not deliver. Inside the pocket, men starved, froze, collapsed from exhaustion. On February 2, 1943, the German 6th Army surrendered. It was Germany's first major strategic defeat on the European front and the turning point of the entire war. For the first time, the Soviet Union proved that it could not only endure, but destroy the most feared army in Europe. And the USSR did not stop there. Summer 1943. From July 2nd to August 23rd, the Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history. Germany deployed its fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, but the Soviets had advantages Germany no longer possessed: superior production, deep defensive lines, and an enormous reserve of manpower. In the end, the Red Army won, pushing German forces westward, holding the initiative until the war's very end. From 1942 to 1945, the Soviet Union became the center of victory in Europe. Nearly 100,000 tanks produced, tens of thousands of Katyusha launchers, millions of rifles, the largest army in the world. From Moscow.
When the final shots of World War II fell silent on May 9, 1945, across the European front, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, forged from the most catastrophic fire of the 20th century. They had defeated Nazi Germany, seized Berlin, raised the red flag over the Reichstag, and became one of the two powers shaping the future of Europe. Yet, even in this glorious victory, the scars ran deep, invisible to much of the world. Scars the Soviet people would carry for decades. The most immediate and visible consequence was near total destruction. Scholars estimate the USSR lost nearly 30 million people, a toll greater than any other nation in the war. Thousands of cities and towns were in ruins. Fertile lands in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia became mine-ridden wastelands. And when victory arrived, millions of families faced a haunting question: can life truly begin again from here? But the harshness of post-war reality went beyond rubble. The Soviet Union had to rebuild a country while remaining in a permanent state of militarization. The war had turned the Soviet Union into a military superpower, and that status demanded constant readiness for the next conflict. Even as the guns fell silent, Joseph Stalin realized something chilling. The world after 1945 would never return to peace. In the West, the United States detonated its first atomic bomb on July 16, 1945, and 3 weeks later, Hiroshima. That bomb wasn't only a message to Japan, it was a warning to every nation hoping to maintain great power status, including the Soviet Union. For Stalin, the meaning was clear. Future conflicts would no longer be fought with tanks, but with technology, political influence, and nuclear power. And so the USSR faced another dark challenge: tightening control within its own borders. Instead of loosening the grip after victory, Stalin expanded the security apparatus. Many historians argue that the years 1945 to 1953 were a continuation of the atmosphere of suspicion left by the Great Purge. The Gulag system persisted. Anyone deemed ideologically deviant could be monitored, arrested, or sent to remote regions. Victory did not bring openness. It convinced Stalin that survival required absolute control. At the same time, the USSR began shaping a new order in Europe. From Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, to Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, pro-Soviet governments emerged one by one. To Stalin, these nations were a protective buffer against Western power. But to many citizens, this new system was controversial, restrictive, and it ignited discontent that would last until the revolutions of 1989. Back inside the USSR,
Reconstruction unfolded amid shortages and food scarcity. Basic goods were hard to find. Entire bombed cities had to be rebuilt from zero. Yet, the centrally planned economy, harsh as it was, enabled rapid recovery. And by the late 1940s, Soviet industrial output had already surpassed pre-war levels. The arms race with the West became the top priority. A turning point came on August 29, 1949. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. Led by physicist Igor Kurchatov, this secret program broke the U.S. nuclear monopoly and ushered the world into a new age, an age where both superpowers could inflict global destruction. Behind this achievement were untold stories, laboratories running day and night, resources stretched to the limit, immense political pressure on scientists. The world was now divided into two opposing halves, the United States and its Western allies versus the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But the dark side of Soviet victory was not just this global confrontation, it was the internal transformation of Soviet society. War had trained the USSR to operate under strict centralization, discipline, and militarization. Many historians argue that wartime values, absolute obedience, total mobilization, and prioritizing military power continued long into peacetime, shaping the Soviet future. By the early 1950s, the Soviet Union stood as a paradox, strong yet exhausted, victorious yet depleted, respected by the world, yet living under constant anxiety of the next conflict. Then came March 5, 1953. Joseph Stalin died. His death closed the chapter on one of the most powerful leaders of the 20th century and opened the door to the longest and tensest confrontation in modern history, the Cold War.
When World War II ended in 1945, Stalin emerged from the ruins of Europe as one of the two most powerful leaders on the planet. The Soviet Union, with the world's largest army and decisive victories on the Eastern Front, now stood on equal footing with the United States. Yet this victory set the USSR on an irreversible path, a confrontation lasting nearly half a century. A confrontation with no declarations, no opening ceremonies, only shadows, suspicion, and the looming threat of nuclear war. History would call it the Cold War. There were no first shots, no marked beginnings. It began with small decisions, huge misunderstandings, and two ideologies looking at each other through a distorted lens. The New World Order was shaped not by peace, but by an invisible boundary, one that thickened over decades until it became a real wall. From the first months after victory, Stalin acted according to historical instinct. Build a security buffer to prevent any future invasion from the West. Eastern European nations, liberated by the Red Army, gradually fell under Moscow's influence. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. For Stalin, this was survival. Russian history had faced invasions from the West again and again, from Napoleon in 1812 to Nazi Germany in 1941. A buffer zone wasn't strategy, it was a necessity. But across the Atlantic, the United States saw a different story. To many in the West, this wasn't defense, it was expansion. both superpowers looked at the same map but saw two completely different worlds. On March 5, 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill delivered a speech that would define an era. An iron curtain has descended across Europe. Churchill no longer held office, but his words captured a growing Western fear that the USSR was turning Eastern Europe into a fully dependent political bloc. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe rebuilt under Moscow's supervision. Industries nationalized, centrally planned economies imposed, security apparatus strengthened. To some, it was stability. To others, a loss of sovereignty. These tensions smoldered for decades, erupting in 1956, then again in 1989. Tensions spiked in 1947. On May 12th, the U.S. announced the Truman Doctrine, promising to support any nation threatened by totalitarianism, a direct counter to communist expansion. Months later came the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. The Soviet Union rejected it immediately, seeing it as a U.S. attempt to buy influence with dollars. Moscow ordered Eastern European allies to refuse Marshall aid and strengthen the Soviet bloc instead. The first major flashpoint arrived on June 24, 1948, the Berlin blockade. Stalin cut off all land and rail routes to West Berlin. He believed the West would give up the city. But the US and Britain didn't retreat. They answered with the Berlin airlift, planes landing every 3 minutes, delivering food, coal, medicine. From June 26, 1948 to May 12, 1949. The operation succeeded. Stalin lifted the blockade. It was more than a victory. It was a message. The world was now divided into two irreconcilable blocs. On April 4, 1949, NATO was born. In response, the Soviet Union tightened its grip over Eastern Europe, paving the way for the Warsaw Pact. Yet while Berlin grabbed the headlines, a far greater shift happened in silence. On August 29, 1949, at Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. A mushroom cloud rose, signaling the end of America's nuclear monopoly. From that moment, the Cold War became nuclear. One mistake could end humanity. Amid this rising tension, one question grew heavier. What would happen if Stalin, the architect of this entire system, were gone? The USSR was built on victory, fear, and absolute concentration of power. Could such a system survive without its central figure? The answer came on March 5, 1953. Stalin died. The news spread in heavy silence. Reactions were mixed. For some, Stalin was the leader who guided them through the Nazi catastrophe. For others, his name meant fear, loss, and the NKVD knock in the night. But no one denied his legacy, a nation militarily strong, mentally exhausted, politically scarred, and uncertain of its future. Into this vacuum stepped Nikita Khrushchev. 3 years later, on February 26, 1956, he did the unthinkable. At a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, he delivered the secret speech, exposing Stalin's abuses and purges. The Soviet system trembled. For ordinary citizens, it felt like fresh air. Reforms began, censorship eased, agriculture reorganized, the security apparatus restrained, and science pushed forward. The world saw the results. October 4, 1957, Sputnik, the first human-made object in orbit. September 14, 1959, Luna 2 reached the moon. And on April 12, 1961, with the words "Poyechali," Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. The USSR glowed with confidence. But rapid rise often leads to dangerous decisions. In 1962, Khrushchev deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The United States discovered them. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. For 13 days, the world stood at the edge of annihilation. Both sides stepped back. The crisis ended, but Khrushchev's prestige never recovered. In 1964, he was removed. Leonid Brezhnev took power. Where Khrushchev symbolized change and chaos, Brezhnev represented stability, order, and military strength. Under him, the USSR reached its geopolitical peak. Soviet influence expanded worldwide. Vietnam, the Middle East, Africa, Eastern Europe. The military grew massive. T-62s, T-72s, S-75 missiles, and a nuclear arsenal rivaling the United States. On the world map, the USSR was never stronger. But this stability hid a price. The planned economy slowed. Productivity collapsed. Factories met quotas instead of quality. Technology lagged behind. Bureaucracy bloated. Propaganda rose. Shelves emptied. Citizens waited in long lines for food. The gap between image and reality widened. By the late 1970s, Brezhnev's health failed. The system drifted on inertia. Yet externally, the USSR still acted like an unchallengeable superpower. Until December 24, 1979. The Politburo sent troops into Afghanistan, a decision later recognized as the beginning of the end. The USSR stood at the height of its power. But from this moment, it began descending the steepest slope of its history.
When the Soviet Union deployed troops to Afghanistan on December 24, 1979, no one imagined that this decision would become the first domino in a chain reaction lasting over 10 years. On paper, it was just a campaign to protect an allied government and maintain a strategic buffer against Western interference. But history rarely follows simple calculations. Afghanistan was not just a border hotspot. It was the first crack. And the longer it went on, the deeper the fissure became, irreparable. In the early 1980s, the Soviet army faced the Mujahideen, backed by the United States, Pakistan's ISI, and several Arab allies. In the treacherous valleys, T-55 and T-62 tanks became powerless. Mi-24 attack helicopters struck relentlessly, yet guerrilla tactics neutralized the Soviets' firepower advantage. From 1986, the Stinger missile arrived, and the balance shifted decisively in favor of the Mujahideen. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died. Billions of rubles were consumed. Afghanistan became a military, economic, and psychological quagmire. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet economy began to stagnate. Problems hidden under Brezhnev, low productivity, bloated bureaucracy, obsolete production systems, now floated to the surface. Brezhnev died in 1982, and the Kremlin entered an era of instability. Yuri Andropov tried to reform, but died in 1984. Konstantin Chernenko succeeded him, yet ill health limited his rule to less than 2 years.
When Chernenko passed away, the party searched for a new breath of leadership. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the youngest general secretary in Soviet history. He understood clearly the critical state of the nation. An economy too weak to sustain a global empire, a society exhausted by propaganda, a war draining the treasury, a political system locked inside its rigid shell. To save the USSR, he introduced two revolutionary policies: perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, expanding information and freedom of speech. But reforming a system built on 70 years of control was an unpredictable gamble. Glasnost opened doors that the state no longer had the power to close. For the first time, citizens read the truth: the Gulag, famine, purges, Chernobyl, decades of strategic mistakes. Everything once hidden was exposed to light, shaking faith in the system to its core. Meanwhile, perestroika plunged the economy into chaos. The transition from a command economy to a more flexible system created a management vacuum. Enterprises didn't know whose orders to follow. Old and new distribution systems clashed. Goods vanished from shelves. Inflation soared. Citizens waited for hours for basic necessities. Gorbachev wanted to save the system, but the result was like removing the last nails holding the Soviet machine upright. And then the Kremlin's greatest fear became reality. Eastern Europe began drifting away. Poland legalized solidarity. Hungary opened its border with Austria, triggering waves of East Germans fleeing to the west. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution unfolded peacefully, but decisively. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, collapsed. Millions stood on the broken concrete, embracing across a boundary that had divided Europe for decades. The Soviet Union did not intervene, could not intervene, and dared not intervene. Gorbachev's policy of nonviolence was celebrated in the West, but it accelerated the collapse of the Soviet satellite system. Then came Chernobyl, April 26, 1986. Reactor Unit 4 exploded, devastating a vast area in Ukraine and exposing the slowness, secrecy, and incompetence of the bureaucratic machinery. Hundreds of thousands were exposed without warning. Chernobyl became a symbol of a system rotting from within. From 1988 to 1991, the republics of the USSR began declaring independence. Lithuania led the way, March 11, 1990. Then Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Moldova. One by one, they broke away. The Soviet Union shrank day by day, like a map slowly being erased. The climax arrived in August 1991. Hardliners staged a coup in Moscow, detaining Gorbachev in Crimea. But the coup collapsed in 3 days after Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank and called citizens to resist. When the plotters surrendered, the Communist Party's power, the backbone of the system, collapsed with them. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president. On December 26, the Supreme Soviet dissolved the USSR. The red hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin, replaced by the tricolor. An empire that had defeated Nazi Germany, sent Gagarin into space, and built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the planet, collapsed without a single final bullet, not because of invasion, but because of contradictions within, an economy that could not evolve, and reforms that spiraled beyond control. The Soviet Union did not die in war. It died in a peace it could no longer manage.
Let us return to where it all began, Stalingrad, the morning of February 2, 1943. A silver-gray sky hung over the rubble. Blackened walls stood silently, relics of unimaginable pain. In the streets, we saw Nazi soldiers being led away, their eyes reflecting an undeniable truth. An army that once swept across Europe had fallen in the very city Hitler believed could never be taken. And today, after tracing a journey spanning more than 70 decades, we finally have enough pieces to answer one central question. What turned the USSR into the most fearsome war machine of the 20th century? And what made it collapse without a final shot fired? The answer is not a battle, not a leader, but a dual nature, a state built on fear and faith, violence and survival, concentrated power, and the silent sacrifices of millions. From 1917, the USSR was born from chaos, not order. From 1924 to 1938, Stalin transformed a slow agrarian nation into an industrial giant through iron discipline, coercion, ruthless decisions, and a strategic vision to ensure survival in a perilous world. From June 22, 1941 to February 2, 1943, the Soviet Union lived on the edge of life and death. They lost millions, lost cities, but never lost willpower. When Stalingrad held firm, the course of the global war changed forever. From 1945 to 1961, they rose into the ranks of superpowers, sending Yuri Gagarin to see Earth from space. From 1949 to 1979, they built a colossal nuclear arsenal, maintaining a fragile balance that preserved peace for decades. But that very strength hid the cracks beneath. The Afghanistan war, economic stagnation, a bloated bureaucracy, reforms that spiraled beyond control. They pushed the USSR from its peak down a slope with no end in sight. On December 26, 1991, the empire that once made the world wary collapsed in silence. Looking back at Stalingrad, we realize something profound. The USSR's true strength was not the T-34 tanks, nor the roaring Katyusha rockets, nor the factories relocated to the Urals. Its strength was the will to survive, forged by poverty, civil war, purges, mistakes, and colossal wars that no other nation endured in a single century. But the system that created that will was also the system that destroyed itself. A state built to win wars could not function in peace. An economy designed to mass-produce tanks could not produce goods for its own people. A power structure strong enough to launch humans into space was too rigid to adapt to a changing world. And so, on December 26, 1991, there was no final battle, no enemy at Moscow's gates, no smoke, no fire, not another Berlin 1945, only a red flag slowly lowered from the Kremlin, and a silence spreading over 1/6 of the Earth's surface. A superpower died in peace, a paradox almost never seen in history. Standing in Stalingrad today, amidst the ruined buildings and haunting silence, we see not just the victories of the Soviet Union, but a warning to every empire. No system is invincible, no power eternal. No machine can function without the people behind it. Yet Stalingrad leaves us something else, a legacy not born from weapons, but from willpower. It reminds us that in the darkest moments, humans can create strength beyond expectation, and in the brightest moments, they can lose everything if they ignore their limits. That is the final story the USSR leaves for the world, a lesson about power, responsibility, the cost of ambition, and the fragility of empires, no matter how great. And the cold wind blowing across the ruins of Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, still reminds us of that truth today. Thank you for staying until the end of this long journey with your historical narrator. The story of the USSR, from civil war to superpower to silent collapse, is only one slice of human history, where power, ambition, and destiny intertwine in unpredictable ways.